He never looked like a man who belonged in a war. Ralph Ingersoll wore suits, not uniforms. His hands were more familiar with paper and ink than steel or gunpowder. He had been a journalist, an editor, a man of words, not of weapons. Yet when the Second World War consumed the planet, he became one of the most dangerous minds in the U.S. Army, not because he knew how to fight, but because he knew how to make others believe. Ingersoll was born into privilege and contradiction. Educated, articulate, and fiercely independent, he had built his name in New York's publishing world before the war. He founded PM, a left-leaning newspaper that defied advertisers, censors, and the political establishment. He admired intellect more than power, imagination more than hierarchy. But as the world collapsed into conflict, he saw something he could not ignore, that war was not only fought with bombs, but with perception. In 1942, he left his typewriter for a uniform, not out of patriotism, but because he wanted to understand how the machinery of belief worked on a global scale. He joined the U.S. Army as an operations officer. He was nearly 40 years old, untrained in combat, surrounded by soldiers half his age. But where they saw strategy as maps and orders, Ingersoll saw it as a form of theater, a stage where deception could save more lives than bullets ever could. At that time, the Allies faced a brutal truth. The Nazi war machine dominated intelligence and reconnaissance. German observers saw everything: troop movements, supply lines, even radio chatter. Every Allied buildup risked exposure. Every false step cost thousands of lives. The Allies had strength, but no invisibility. To win, they needed to become invisible, or better yet, to become what the enemy expected to see. Ingersoll understood this instinctively. He believed that war was not a contest of force, but of imagination. He wrote in his notes, "If the enemy believes what you want him to believe, you have already won half the battle." It was an artist's approach to warfare, born in the mind of a man who had never fired a shot. He was first assigned to the psychological warfare branch, a unit still undefined, still learning what psychological even meant in military terms. Most officers thought it was propaganda, leaflets, and loudspeakers. Ingersoll saw beyond that. He argued that deception should not inform the enemy. It should trap him, shape his movements, occupy his divisions, force him to fight ghosts. His ideas were too unconventional for most. To the career military, he was an outsider, with too many theories and too little discipline. But higher up, a few commanders recognized his value. The war in Europe would soon require a scale of deception the world had never seen. The Allied command needed minds that could think in illusions, artists, engineers, actors, and liars in uniform. Ingersoll was all of those at once. In late 1943, he was summoned to Washington. The plans for the eventual invasion of Western Europe, what would become D-Day, were already in motion. The Allies needed to convince the Germans that the main invasion would strike at Calais, not Normandy. They needed a phantom army. Ingersoll's mind lit up. He had spent years directing journalists, illustrators, and photographers, people who could make fiction look like truth. Now he was being asked to do the same for generals. He was told to develop operational visual deception, the art of making the impossible look real. He began recruiting not soldiers, but artists, painters, sculptors, sound engineers, set designers, many of them from advertising agencies, art schools, or Broadway. He understood that illusion required craft. To deceive the Nazi high command, they would have to create a world that could fool even the sharpest eyes from the air and the sharpest ears on the radio. The idea was audacious. The plan was simple in theory and nearly impossible in execution: create an army that didn't exist. He wrote in his personal log, "If they expect a division, we will give them the sound, the sight, and the shape of one." Ingersoll's first test came in England. He was assigned to help coordinate decoy operations meant to mislead the Luftwaffe: inflatable vehicles, fake airfields, dummy tanks positioned under camouflage nets. But he wanted to go further. A fake tank could fool a reconnaissance plane. A fake army could fool an entire intelligence apparatus. He began sketching a structure, a self-contained unit built purely for deception. It would have visual elements, sound units, and radio operators skilled in mimicry. It would move, broadcast, and behave exactly like a real division, yet have no combat capability at all. His proposal met resistance. Senior officers thought it absurd to waste manpower and resources on theatrics. But Ingersoll knew that in war, what the enemy believed was often more powerful than what actually existed. He pressed forward. Through a combination of persuasion, persistence, and intellectual arrogance, he secured limited approval to experiment. He recruited engineers from the Signal Corps, artists from the Corps of Engineers, and sound specialists from the movie industry. From these unlikely ingredients, the skeleton of the Ghost Army began to form. Ingersoll's command style was unlike anything the Army had seen. He treated deception as performance. Every operation required choreography. The placement of inflatable tanks, the broadcast of engine noises, the movement of fake columns at dawn. He directed soldiers as if they were actors, their stage the European countryside. Behind his sharp intellect was a simple belief. If you could make the enemy hesitate, you could save lives. Every German division chasing a phantom was one not facing the real invasion force. Every bomb dropped on an empty field was a bomb not killing real men. By early 1944, his ideas had crystallized into a philosophy of war. He wrote, "Deception is a weapon of mercy. It kills through imagination, not through blood." The Army began to notice results. Preliminary tests of small-scale decoy operations in England misled German reconnaissance repeatedly. Radio intercepts confirmed that enemy analysts were tracking non-existent troop movements. What had begun as a civilian experiment in illusion was becoming a strategic asset. Ingersoll's mixture of arrogance and genius made him difficult to work with but impossible to ignore. He was not a soldier, and he never pretended to be one. He carried himself like a director overseeing a production. The war was his theater, the enemy his audience, and his performances were working. As the D-Day invasion approached, his theories were absorbed into larger operations of deception, Fortitude North, Fortitude South, and finally, Operation Bodyguard, the grand Allied plan to confuse the Germans about when and where the invasion would come. Ingersoll's fingerprints were all over it. He advised on the use of fake radio chatter, the deployment of dummy vehicles, and the manipulation of visual cues from the air. The success of these efforts convinced the Germans that the real invasion would strike at Calais weeks after it had already begun at Normandy. But Ingersoll's legacy was not the grand strategic deception. It was the human one, the creation of a dedicated field unit, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, built entirely on his philosophy. It was an army designed to exist only in the enemy's imagination. The men who joined it were sculptors, sound technicians, art students, and architects, people who understood how to build illusions. Ingersoll wasn't their battlefield commander. He was their intellectual architect. He gave them the tools to make the unreal seem real. Inflatable tanks, sound trucks with recorded engines, fake radio traffic that mimicked entire divisions. From that moment on, he had transformed from journalist to illusionist, from editor of words to editor of war. He once described his work in a single sentence: "We make the truth out of lies, and the lies out of truth." In a conflict defined by destruction, Ralph Ingersoll created something unique, a weapon that didn't kill, but misled. The Army didn't quite understand him. Many officers despised him, but the few who recognized his genius gave him what he needed most: freedom. He had no medals, no heroics, no battlefield glory. Yet his fingerprints would soon mark one of the strangest and most successful operations of the entire war. A campaign of pure deception that would make German generals doubt their own eyes. He was not a soldier. He was a writer who learned to command through illusion, and in the coming months, his imagination would save more lives than any gun ever could. They built an army out of papier-mâché, rubber, recorded sound, and impeccable timing. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops arrived in Europe not as a fighting formation, but as a lie made three-dimensional, a deliberate fiction with unit patches, march routes, radio signatures, and the full sensory footprint of military life. It was an army designed to be seen, heard, and catalogued by enemy observers, an army whose only mission was to be believed. The unit was compact and odd by any conventional measure. Composed largely of civilians repurposed as soldiers, its ranks included painters from art schools, designers from advertising firms, sound engineers from the movie business, sculptors, and craftsmen. Many had been recruited from the creative communities of New York and Los Angeles. Their skills were aesthetic and technical rather than combative. How to paint a shadow so it read as depth through an aerial lens, how to splice a soundtrack so the illusion of an approaching convoy traveled for miles down a road, how to fashion a rubberized tank that would cast the right silhouette from 1,000 feet. They were small teams of specialists trained to perform an act of mass deception in the open air of Europe. At the center of the enterprise was the philosophy that perception could be directed like artillery. The Ghost Army's methods were threefold: visual deception that fooled reconnaissance photography, sonic deception that projected the sounds of forces that did not exist, and radio deception that replicated the voice and pattern of legitimate units over enemy airwaves. Each element was rehearsed, timed, and layered until the composite estimate available to a German analyst would point to a reality that did not exist. Visual decoys were the most immediate and visible element. Inflatable tanks, trucks, and field guns, far from being crude props, were engineered to reflect sunlight and cast convincing shadows. They were mounted on wheeled frames, set up in plausible formations, and painted with authentic-looking weathering. Dummy airfields sprouted false runways and wire antennae. Canvas-covered vehicles were arranged to suggest movement and readiness. From the air, where many intelligence assessments began and ended, these images read as legitimate hardware. The construction of these decoys required craftsmanship. Artists shaped and textured rubberized skins so that aerial photographs would show the correct tonal contrasts. Painters layered grime and rust in patterns consistent with real wear. The placement of a decoy was engineered down to the grain of the soil, the disturbance of earth, the shadow toward noon, the spacing between vehicles. Anything that could betray the illusion was treated as a design problem. Reconnaissance photography was studied to learn the perspectives enemy pilots favored, and the decoys were designed to survive those angles. Sound was the element that made the illusions live. The Ghost Army carried with them a bank of recorded noises: the rumble of tracked vehicles, the clank of metal on the move, the low thrum of diesel convoys, the percussive staccato of artillery placement. Large trucks loaded with amplifiers and speakers would drive circuits on roads at dawn and dusk, broadcasting the sounds along valleys, around bends, and into enemy observation posts. The recordings were not played at random. They were layered and routed so that listeners would infer movement, engines accelerating, gears shifting, intervals matching the speed expected of a mechanized column. Sound operations were logistical theater. Speakers were hidden in hedgerows, booms were extended, and the angle of sound projection was adjusted to account for wind and terrain. Engineers used playback techniques to simulate distance, the gradual swelling of volume, the drop-off intended to match fade as a convoy passed an observer. A convoy of 12 trucks could become, in the mind of an enemy listener, a full armored division if the recording suggested the engines of hundreds of vehicles and the intermittent clatter of heavier hardware. The psychology was simple and ruthless. The ear fills in what the eye may miss. Radio deception completed the sensory triangle. Skilled operators created traffic that matched the pattern, cadence, and encryption habits of real divisions. Radio was the language of command and logistics. To replicate the chatter of a unit was to replicate its presence. Operators imitated call signs, messaged in the rhythm that standard units used, and even emulated the mistakes and redundancies that seasoned enemy signals analysts would expect. The goal was not to produce convincing content alone, but to reproduce the pattern of communication that suggested real command structures, supply requests, and movement orders. German intercept stations traced these signatures and incorporated them into their operational assessments. This orchestration required planning and intelligence as meticulous as any combat operation. Planners studied intercepted German reconnaissance reports and the habitual routes of Luftwaffe overflights. They timed sound operations to coincide with typical aerial reconnaissance windows, set up decoys where photo runs would capture them, and ensured radio chatter reinforced the visual and acoustic signals. Deception demanded a choreography of falsehood. When the recorded engines rolled, somebody else would be laying out the dummy tents. When the radio fake ordered a midday halt, the sound trucks would simulate idling engines. The synthesis had to be seamless. The Ghost Army's operations were not theatrical stunts. They were surgical in their intent. Diversions were aimed at specific outcomes: to fix German units in place, to draw flanking elements away from a planned attack, to convince enemy commanders that the Allies had concentrated armor in one sector when the real buildup occurred elsewhere. In practical terms, that meant fewer German divisions ready to counter an actual offensive, more artillery falling upon unoccupied fields, and time bought for real Allied maneuvering. One recurring pattern in the unit's work was mimicking a credible personality for the fabricated forces. The Ghost Army did not scatter its decoys randomly. It constructed histories. Fake divisions were given identification, patches, radio habits, and plausible logistical footprints. This made them believable over time. Reconnaissance that noted a recurring patch or a pattern of movement over several days was more likely to accept the existence of a unit than a one-off visual anomaly. The deception thus became cumulative, a history of presence created by repeated sensory cues. The tactical impact of these operations was concrete. German commanders diverted troops to counter phantom threats, left gaps in their lines, and expended ammunition on empty encampments. Tracked armor moved toward illusions of strength and away from the true points of Allied interest. The unit's actions were designed to be invisible in the grand histories of battles, but their effects echoed through casualty lists and campaign timetables. Divisions that engaged non-existent targets found their readiness reduced. The enemy's situational picture, once polluted with artifice, produced tactical mistakes. Execution required discipline. The Ghost Army trained for precision. Sets had to be erected at night and struck quickly before the filmed approach of reconnaissance. Sound crews needed exact timing so that a recording would be at the right place when an aerial route passed over. Radio operators maintained scripts and call sign consistency across multiple days of operations. Mistakes would reveal the ruse and undo weeks of planning. The men who served in the 23rd were therefore soldiers of a different temperament, meticulous, patient, and inventive. There were risks beyond exposure. Placing a decoy in a seemingly empty field could invite artillery fire. The unit accepted that some illusions would be shelled. The purpose was not to lure the enemy into killing a phalanx of dummies, but to compel the enemy to expend resources on the wrong ground. When guns found a lifeless camp, the result was less damage to the Allies than would have occurred against a real concentration. That calculus, accepting inert losses as a means to save lives elsewhere, was a moral tightrope the Ghost Army walked in silence. Secrecy was enforced stringently. The unit's activities were classified, and men who served in it were sworn to secrecy for decades. The operations were omitted from official histories, logs were redacted, and awards were private or muted. The rationale was operational. If the enemy learned that entire divisions could be conjured from rubber and sound, the value of the method would diminish. Only after the Cold War's détente, decades later, did historians and the public gain access to the details of the Ghost Army's campaigns. The unit's composition also left a peculiar legacy. Men trained as artists and sound technicians returned to civilian life with experiences that privileged illusion as a strategic tool. Some took those lessons into advertising, some into film, others into architecture and design. The exchanges between military necessity and creative practice became part of post-war cultural transfer. Techniques for staging perception migrated from battlefields to media, from military deception to commercial image-making. Operationally, the Ghost Army's work intersected with larger Allied deception campaigns. The phantom divisions they produced reinforced strategic-level feints designed to mislead enemy high command about the timing and direction of major operations. The impact was asymmetric. The cost to the Allies, labor, materials, and a handful of casualties among technicians and operators, was small compared to the strategic confusion sown in the German chain of command. In a conflict where industrial capacity and manpower were decisive, forcing the enemy to disperse his assets was a force multiplier. The men of the Ghost Army were peripheral not by accident, but by design. Their successes were measured in what did not happen: fewer counterattacks, fewer intercepted convoys, and, most tellingly, the absence of German units where Allied forces eventually struck. They were historians of absence, documenting the places the enemy went when misled, the zones left thin of defense, the windows created for actual offensives. The technology they used was low-tech in one sense: rubber, canvas, recorded audio, and high art in another. The engineering lay in human perception. The unit exploited the ways observers, human and mechanical, made assumptions from partial data. Photographic analysts could be fooled by a convincing silhouette repeated across time. Signals intelligence could be misled by scripts that mirrored genuine radio traffic. Auditory observation could be directed by projection. All these vulnerabilities were well known to military planners, but the Ghost Army operationalized their exploitation through artistry and discipline. Practical outcomes validated the approach. Tactical reports after operations often documented German attention directed toward the wrong sectors. Supply units ran to nowhere. Armored battalions repositioned in response to phantoms and thereby reduced pressure on real Allied attacks. The indirect toll was measurable. Operations that might otherwise have encountered stiffer resistance found more manageable opposition. Lives were spared not by force, but by misdirection. The Ghost Army's secrecy extended beyond the battlefield. Men were instructed not to speak of their roles for decades. Memory kept the unit's methods close. Only in later years did veterans begin to surface with photographs and accounts. The declassification of records fueled historians' curiosity: how a corps of artists and engineers had contributed to a machine of war. Public recognition lagged because the unit's success was a lack of headlines. It worked precisely by not being caught. Ralph Ingersoll's intellectual imprint threaded through these operations. His conception of deception as theater translated into military practice. He had recruited craftsmen rather than commissioned officers, prioritized plausibility over firepower, and elevated perception to the level of strategy. The resulting unit challenged the military's conventional wisdom and proved that strategic imagination could be weaponized. When the war closed and operations wound down, the instrumental value of the Ghost Army persisted in gray ways. Military planners from Allied nations studied the unit's records and adapted elements of its practice to peacetime intelligence and psychological operations. Techniques of misdirection found applications in covert operations and information campaigns during the Cold War. The aesthetic methodologies developed by sculptors and sound engineers were repurposed in the rhetoric of influence battles that followed. In the end, the Ghost Army's legacy was a paradox. An army that did not exist altered the movements of armies that did. Its tools were cheap relative to armor and ammunition, but their strategic return on investment remained high. The unit demonstrated a principle that has haunted military thought since. Controlling the adversary's perception can be as decisive as controlling the battlefield. Ingersoll's experiment showed that war is not solely a clash of weapons, but a contest over reality itself. That contest left an imprint on the men who made the illusions and on the commanders who finally understood the value of their work. The Ghost Army dissolved as military necessity faded, its members folding back into civilian life with odd souvenirs. Inflatable tanks repurposed as storefronts, sound reels archived in basements, sketches of decoys tucked into portfolios. The operations that once required silence were finally spoken of, and the unit received belated recognition in histories that began to appreciate irony as a form of strategy. The story of the Ghost Army is not merely about trickery. It is the story of rethinking what warfare could be, of moving from attrition to artifice, from destruction to diversion, from winning through force to winning through belief. It is the story of a civilian's audacity turned into doctrine, a belief that the enemy's mind could be the battlefield, and that convincing an opponent to fight a shadow was in the arithmetic of war. a kind of victory. In the theaters of Europe, where mud and steel decided so many fates, the Ghost Army's work remained ephemeral and therefore potent. The colonels who measured battalions by numbers and tanks may have grumbled, but the outcomes, missed targets, diverted divisions, safer crossings, spoke in tangible lives saved. The unit's operations were soft in material and hard in consequence. For generations after, military thinkers would study the Ghost Army not as a curiosity, but as an early demonstration of information warfare. The unit anticipated later doctrines, manipulating perception to shape behavior, creating false narratives to direct movement, using low-cost deception to leverage high-cost outcomes. Those lessons would reappear in other guises and technologies, but the core remained. The human mind is a system that can be fooled, and in warfare, a fooled enemy is an advantage beyond measure. When historians finally pieced together the Ghost Army's record, they did so with a disquieting admiration. The operation sat at the intersection of art and tactics, proving that the tools of creativity could be repurposed for survival. It also proved something more uncomfortable, that in modern war the truth could be manufactured as skillfully as any bomb. The army that did not exist had been built to make others act as if it did. In doing so, it remade the battlefield itself. He never fired a shot, but entire German divisions moved because of him. By the time the war neared its end, Ralph Ingersoll's strange creation, an army built on nothing but illusion, had already outperformed expectations. Yet, its most profound impact wasn't in the campaigns it helped win, but in the minds it changed. How soldiers saw truth, how commanders defined power, and how nations began to understand that the most dangerous weapon in war is belief. In the spring of 1945, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops conducted its final and most daring operations. The Rhine River marked the last great natural barrier inside Germany, and the Nazi command was determined to defend it. Every bridge, every crossing point was fortified and watched. The Allies needed to move fast, but if they forced a crossing where the enemy was ready, the cost would be measured in thousands of lives. Once again, deception was the only rational weapon. Ingersoll's men were ordered to simulate the presence of entire armored divisions near the small town of Viersen, a place chosen not for its strategic value, but for its visibility. Their goal was simple and deadly serious: convince the Germans that a massive attack was coming there, while the real crossings happened miles away under cover of darkness. The operation was executed with precision and calm. Within 48 hours, the Ghost Army constructed fake artillery batteries, fuel dumps, and convoys that seemed to stretch for miles. The engineers inflated rubber tanks and trucks, arranging them under camouflage nets exactly as a real division would. Sound crews set up along the roads, broadcasting the mechanical hum of engines and the metallic echoes of movement. Radio operators transmitted in disciplined patterns, building the illusion of command and coordination. From the air, it looked authentic. From intercepted radio traffic, it sounded genuine. To German reconnaissance officers, it was proof. They repositioned forces toward Viersen, pouring men and ammunition into a defensive line against an attack that would never come. And when the real Allied assault began elsewhere, the defenders of Viersen were staring into smoke and shadows, firing artillery at ghosts. The crossing of the Rhine succeeded with minimal resistance in the sectors that mattered. For the 23rd, it was the culmination of years of experimentation, deception elevated to strategy. What had started as an eccentric idea in the mind of a civilian writer had saved lives on a continental scale. But the end of war brought a strange silence. The Ghost Army's work was classified, buried beneath layers of military secrecy. Its soldiers returned home unrecognized, unable to speak about the missions that had defined their lives. Ralph Ingersoll himself slipped back into civilian obscurity, his name reduced to a few quiet mentions in bureaucratic reports. He resumed writing, published memoirs that hinted at his wartime role but concealed the details. Even his family knew little. History forgot him for decades, and perhaps that was fitting. His victories had been invisible. His success measured not in territory gained or battles won, but in the confusion of enemies and the survival of allies. He had turned imagination into a defensive weapon, one that killed nothing but arrogance. Yet the legacy of his idea outlived the war. In the 1950s and 1960s, as the Cold War redefined conflict, intelligence agencies began to recognize the Ghost Army as the prototype for a new kind of warfare: psychological, informational, and deceptive. Its techniques, manipulating sensory evidence, crafting plausible narratives, shaping enemy expectations, became the foundation of entire doctrines. Military academies quietly studied its reports. Propaganda divisions borrowed its language. What had once been dismissed as trickery became policy. Ingersoll himself saw the irony. He had entered the army to prove that imagination mattered. He left knowing that his ideas had become tools for a new generation of wars, ones fought less with bullets and more with perception. He often remarked in later years that truth in wartime is not a fact but an effect. It was both a warning and an admission. The Ghost Army never received medals, but its statistics were undeniable. Over 20 major deceptions in France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Germany. Hundreds of thousands of enemy troops diverted, thousands of Allied lives saved. In military archives, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops appeared as a ghost unit, even on paper, a presence that never officially existed. But commanders who had seen its results knew its worth. General Patton himself remarked privately that the unit could make an army appear where none existed and make the enemy waste his strength chasing it. When the war ended, the Ghost Army dissolved quietly. Its members returned to their studios, workshops, and recording rooms. Some became architects, film producers, or teachers. Others carried the strange burden of knowing that their art had once shaped the outcome of battles. Many struggled to reconcile the beauty of what they created with the horror it was built to serve. The sound of engines, the illusion of armor, the false hope in the eyes of enemy soldiers, all of it was art used for survival. Ralph Ingersoll withdrew from military life entirely. He returned to journalism and political commentary, but he never spoke publicly about his role in the deception campaigns. Official recognition came decades later, long after his death. In 1996, the Ghost Army's work was declassified, and surviving veterans began to share their memories. What emerged was a story that defied easy classification: part military history, part art experiment, part moral puzzle. The declassified reports revealed meticulous drawings of dummy tanks, diagrams of sound projection arcs, and transcripts of radio patterns designed to mimic entire corps. Photographs showed men painting shadows under inflatable trucks or testing recorded noises in empty fields. The operations read like stage directions rather than battle orders. It was war as theater, and it had worked. Modern military historians often compare the Ghost Army to the modern concept of information dominance. The unit's operations anticipated an era in which perception itself would become a weapon, where controlling what the enemy saw and heard would matter more than destroying what he possessed. Ingersoll's theories foreshadowed the age of misinformation, cyber warfare, and digital propaganda. He had shown, long before satellites and algorithms, that the human mind was the most critical terrain. But there was a deeper moral question behind his legacy. Could deception ever be called humane? The Ghost Army had killed no one directly, yet its success had led others to their deaths. German soldiers deployed to false fronts, bombers attacking empty ground. For Ingersoll, the answer lay in intention. His purpose had never been to mislead for cruelty, but to protect lives by confusing the machine of war. "If a lie can save a life," he once wrote, "it is more honest than a truth that kills." As decades passed, the men of the Ghost Army began to receive recognition. Exhibitions displayed their sketches, sound maps, and photographs. Documentaries told their story to audiences that could hardly believe it. Veterans in their 80s stood before inflatable tanks reconstructed for museums, laughing at how something so absurd could have been so effective. And behind every anecdote, there lingered the same astonishment that creativity had once been a weapon. Today, historians speak of Ralph Ingersoll as the unlikely father of operational deception. He proved that a mind trained in persuasion and design could outthink a regime obsessed with power and precision. His work blurred the boundaries between civilian and military, between illusion and intelligence. It redefined the value of imagination in the machinery of war. Ingersoll's life ended quietly. There were no parades, no decorations, no final speeches. He died a civilian again, the way he had started. But the army he imagined outlived him in every sense. Its philosophy survives in modern doctrines of misdirection, electronic warfare, and psychological strategy. Every time a military planner considers how to make the enemy see what isn't there, a fragment of Ingersoll's thinking lives on. What remains remarkable is the paradox he left behind. The most peaceful man in a violent time had taught soldiers how to lie, and in doing so had saved them. His was a victory made of silence and smoke, recorded not in blood, but in the absence of it. The Ghost Army never conquered land. It conquered certainty. By the end of the war, even German officers began to suspect that something unreal was haunting their maps, divisions that appeared and vanished, radio signatures that led to nowhere, the echo of armor that never arrived. They called it Die Geisterarmee, the army of ghosts. They had been fighting shadows, and the shadows had won. For all its strangeness, the Ghost Army's story is the purest example of what war became in the 20th century. Not just a struggle of force, but of perception. A conflict where the sharpest weapon was not steel, but imagination. Ralph Ingersoll's life was proof of that. A journalist turned tactician, a writer who rewrote the logic of battle, a civilian who showed generals that the mind could be a battlefield. His name may be buried in the footnotes of history, but his lesson endures, that power is not only the ability to destroy, but the brilliance to deceive. In the end, his ghosts did not disappear. They became the blueprint for an era where wars are fought with signals, simulations, and stories, where armies still march through minds before they ever reach the field. And somewhere, in that quiet truth, Ralph Ingersoll's impossible army still moves, unseen, unarmed, undefeated.